What is going on, guys? Matt with MotoWorks here, and we're going to diagnose the ignition system on this thing because I want to take it for a ride. And my little guy has been dying to go for a ride on this thing. But we're going to be diagnosing the ignition system on the bike today, and with me I have an ignition mate. You don't need something this fancy, and we'll go over in a minute what this is. And I also have a voltmeter or multimeter. I'm mainly concerned about voltage, but I have a multimeter as well. As you can see, I stripped the bike down again, which kind of made me sad, but oh well. I also went out and I bought a brand new battery, and I also got a couple various little parts. Like I said in the last upload, I'm going to be actually fixing this thing up because I want to get it to a point where I just need the pieces to fix the ignition, and then I can just go out and ride it and see if anything else breaks. Because we still don't know. We still don't know if the clutch works. We don't know if the transmission works. We know nothing about it. So I'd like to get it to a point where I can get it out on the road and test those things. But more on that later. We're going to be diagnosing the ignition system today. And the ignition system on this bike is a CDI ignition system. So it's capacitive discharge ignition, CDI. All right, now guys, to diagnose the ignition system on this, first of all, we have to break it down into the 5 separate parts. So the first 2 are the battery and charging system. We want to make sure that, number 1, we have a good battery, which this is a brand new battery. And then we also want to check the charging system on this. Now the bike does start, it does run, and I'm kind of fortunate because it actually started to shut off and not restart again, which, if you know anything about diagnosing something, that's actually a blessing because I can actually test stuff and find what isn't working. If it shuts off and then restarts right away, it makes it very difficult to figure out what's going on. But the fact that it shuts off and it doesn't restart is great. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to check the charging system, and then I'm just going to wait for the bike to shut off so then we can start diagnosing the system. Now, the first 2 components of it are the charging and the battery. The next 3 components are the pulse generators. Those are what get a signal from the crankshaft to say, hey, it's time to fire, send an ignition signal. It sends the ignition signal up to the CDI unit, which is the second part of that system. And that CDI unit says, okay, I got a signal from the rear firing cylinders, so cylinders 3 and 4 are saying, hey, we need spark. So it sends it to the CDI unit. From that CDI unit, it sends it out to the coils, and as long as those coils are working and doing what they're supposed to, it'll send spark out to our spark plug. Now the problem is the front system is always working. That's never stopped working. I'm getting spark on the front 2 cylinders, and we found that out in the very first video where it's sparking at the front cylinders and it's not sparking at the rear cylinders. So the problem is going to be in the rear system. Now I highly doubt that it's the coils or the wires, since both sides stop sparking. If it was one side or the other, I'd say you probably have an issue with a coil going bad. If it just didn't fire at all, I would also say that you probably had a coil going bad. Typically, coils either work or they don't work. I have had instances where the coil was bad and it didn't go bad until it warmed up, but that was only one time I had that happen. Most of the time, if the coil is firing the spark plug, it's always going to be firing the spark plug. So then that takes us back to the CDI box. So we need to see if that's sending a signal out to those coils. And then that brings us back to the pulse generator. Is it even getting the signal in the first place? So that's the breakdown of the system. And it all works on voltage. Voltage, number 1, you're not going to be able to get a voltage signal from a pulse generator. Reason being, it sends it so quickly that the meter, number 1, can't pick up on it, let alone measure it to any accuracy. So you're not going to be able to measure it with just a voltmeter. What you need is this. Now what this is a peak voltage tester, basically. It's called the ignition mate. And this measures spark plug output. It measures very low peak voltage, very high peak voltage, and it does everything you need to measure the voltage at the various components in the ignition system. And it measures it in peak voltage. Basically what this does is it takes a snapshot of voltage at a given time. So whereas this can't pick it up, this not only picks it up, but it kind of sets a freeze frame of that voltage at a given time while you're cranking something over. So for example, when we're testing the pulse generators, when it's just cranking over, I should see a voltage of around 5 volts, somewhere in there between 0 to 5 volts for peak voltage. And going through the line, it can be up to as much as, I think, almost 30,000 volts, I believe, to the spark plug. But I'm not 100% sure on that. Every system is going to be a little bit different. But this measures down to the minute all the way up to the extreme. So what we're going to do now is we're going to test the charging system, make sure that's working, and then we're going to let the bike warm up. Once it shuts off, then we're going to test the ignition system. Now the way I work on it is I'm actually going to go from the pulse generators out to the spark plugs, basically. I'm going to start there because typically on these older bikes, pulse generators are kind of the #1 thing that goes bad on these older bikes. They get hot, they cool off, and electronics don't like to get hot and cool down. They just don't like that their whole lives. So typically that's what goes bad, but hey, we'll see. So I'm just going to fire it up now and we'll check the charging system. All right, so first thing I'm going to be testing is going to be battery voltage with it off. You always want to compare your off voltage to your running voltage. So right there we have 12.8 volts. Turn the key on, it's going to drop a little bit. That's okay. Drop down to 12.4, which should be plenty enough. And we're going to fire it up. Like I said, it's a new battery, so this should fire up almost instantly. Look, our voltage is going up. It's charging the battery just like it should. 14.7, that's a great voltage reading. So we know our charging system is working. Now we'll just let it run. I'm going to get my tool set up while it's running, and then when it shuts off, we'll be able to test everything. Alright guys, so here we are. It won't start. It's getting ready to backfire, I'm sure. So it won't start. Now, the way that I test an ignition system is I start at the very first signal given. So we already know that the battery's charging and we already know the battery's good. We now need to test where the signal originates from, and that is from those pulse generators. Now, these are still available from Honda OEM, so if that gives you any kind of idea as to if they go bad or not, yes, they go bad. The fact that a 1980s, this bike is over 30 years old now, and the fact that you can still get electronic parts for this bike is definitely a telltale sign of, I think, that that's what the problem's going to be. But I'm going to show you guys how to test it right now using this. Now, this is how I test it. This tool is about $500. I have this on loan from my awesome boss who said I could borrow it just to diagnose to see what's wrong with this. You can get similar peak voltage testers. You probably don't need to go this fancy, but it makes good for television because it's easy for you guys to see what I'm talking about. But I'm going to test those pulse generators now, and then we'll show you see if they're working, and if they are, then we'll go further than that. Okay, so with this test here, we're going to be looking at this meter here. There's just a little light that's going to light up, and it's going to go up this chart here. All right, now this is peak voltage here, so it's down at as low as 1 volt, like I said before. It goes all the way up to 10 volts on one scale, and then as you up the scale, it'll up the voltage all the way up to 40 kV. So I think that's 40,000, which don't quote me on that, but if anybody knows 100% sure, I believe that's what that is. I'm still kind of new to this. I do know that, this is up to 400 volts, so it's safe to say that all the way up is going to be 40,000 volts. But all I'm working on here is a 0 to 10 volt reading, because when the pulse generators are just trying to fire up, they're at a really low voltage. So we're only going to see like 1, maybe 2 volts if it's working right. And if it's not working right, we're not going to see any voltage at all. It's not going to spike the meter at all. So what we're doing here is we're just taking these probes, these guys here, and we're just going to piggyback them here. This is where the pulse generators plug into. This is where they feed their signal in. And the 2 in the back here, I don't know what cylinders they're for, but if we find a problem, I'll be able to tell you exactly what cylinders are for. But the 2 back here that plug in are 1 pulse generator, and then the 2 up here are another pulse generator. So the one on top is a yellow, white, and then yellow wire, and then the one on the bottom is a blue, white, and then a blue wire. So first one we're going to test is going to be this rear one, the blue and the blue, white. And then we're going to see what we get. Like I said, hopefully the bike doesn't start when I'm doing this. I actually did this test before and the bike started. I actually was going to do this test for you guys before, but the bike started and ran and I wasn't able to do it. So hopefully it stays not running so I can show you guys this. Okay, so we're looking at this here, and like I said, it's only maybe going to rise just a little bit. Just going to see it flicker on there. Well, it started. Not what I wanted to have happen. Alright, so it started. Hopefully it shuts off again. But see, our voltage at idle is right around 4 volts, somewhere in there. So we know that this blue and blue-white is working. I'm going to quick probe the other ones to see what signal I get out of them. Looks like they are working as well. Same output roughly. Looks like it's a little bit less, but roughly the same. They go up just fine. So that's a bummer. Like I said, if it's an intermittent issue, there's nothing I can test at this point, guys. So those are both working. Let me see if the bike shuts off. Well, guys, this is my "are you kidding me" face, because are you kidding me, Christine? I hate it. I hate intermittent issues. Now off camera, I am going to tell you that it is something going on with these pulse generators, because right before this thing wouldn't start off camera, I actually tested it and I wasn't getting an output signal on one of the pulse generators. So there's definitely something intermittent going on there, but I want to catch it again so I can show you guys, not to prove to you guys, but basically to prove to myself that I'm not nuts. Because that's what this bike is making me, nuts. Hopefully it shuts off again, guys, and then I can show you what's going on with it, but time will tell. Alrighty, so now since this thing insists on just running, I'll show you the next part to check. So after we verified that the pulse generators are putting out at least 1 to 5 volts when you're cranking it, after the pulse generators give the signal to the CDI box, it then distributes that signal out to the coils. Now what we're going to do now is measure that coil signal output, which should be, we got to move our meter up to about 400 peak voltage. And then for this one, we're going to probe the yellow wire with blue tracer and black wire with white tracer here, and we should get somewhere in the 200 to 300 range. Looks like we're at about 240, and as you rev it up, it should go up to almost 400 volts. So that's sending the signal out to the coil, and then that's the yellow blue wire, and then we also have the blue wire with the yellow tracer, and that one should look identical. Now the voltage is not as important as the consistency. Let me put the fan fuse back in. Now the voltage you're getting, it doesn't really matter. As long as they're both the same, you should be all right. Now when that's cranking over, it's not going to be quite as high because the engine's not spinning as fast. It'll probably be a little less than the 200 volt range, but you should get the same reading on both wires. All right? So that means that the CDI is at least putting out the voltage it needs to, leaving the last piece of the puzzle to those coils, or the spark plug wires, the spark plug, or the spark plug boots. Now you're already going to check the spark plugs as a first thing, so we already ruled out that the spark plugs are bad, and since this works and worked already, we know that these wires are good, or at least good enough to send spark to the spark plug. Since we've already seen them working, it kind of rules that part out, so you would only be left with the coil itself not producing the voltage it needs, and the simple way to test that is to see if it's sparking at the spark plug. So those are the three parts to the ignition system, and like I said in the beginning, the most common part that fails are those pulse generators. This bike has made me a liar in every sense of the word because it just keeps on running and working, and I cannot explain it, guys. I just can't. The only thing I saw is those pulse generators weren't working, at least these front two wires here, the yellow and the yellow white. Those were not producing any volts. Turn the camera on to show you guys, and now the bike refuses to shut off. So this is the part in this Worth It series where I kind of want to just tell you guys that these are the issues that you run into with bikes just like this. I got the bike for free, so it's okay to put a little bit of money into it. It's okay to put a little bit of time into it to get it running. But how much time do you spend? How much money do you put into something like this? And ultimately, is it going to be reliable, or is it going to let me sit? Right now, the bike runs great, idles just fine. I mean, I've had this bike running now for the past hour off and on. I've been starting it, I've been stopping it. It's just run straight through. I did all those tests to it. You saw it got great results. The bike works. I don't know if it just woke up all of a sudden and now it works. But to put it to you this way, if you were to take a bike like this to a shop, at this point, we're pretty deep into it. I wanted this to be a 3-part series at max. Trust me, guys, I did not know that this thing was going to be a hassle when I started this series. I literally thought I'd just clean the carburetors, throw a fresh set of tires on it, brake pads, and I'd be telling you, oh yeah, this is a great bike. You know, a little bit of time and effort went into cleaning the carburetors, but you know, all in all, it's a great bike. But that's not the case. I didn't pre-select this bike. I didn't, pull a spark plug wire off and say, oh, it's got a running problem, guys. Let's see what it is. No, it legit has a problem. It is an intermittent problem. And those are the worst type of problems because they give you nothing but time invested. And time is money. If you took this into a shop, you would be probably over $1,000 in just labor alone. And this is what the bike looks like after $1,000 or so in labor, with more money to come, because again, this is an intermittent issue, so it doesn't mean I fixed it. And if this shuts off when you're riding it down the road, that's going to make for a really bad day. So I want to make sure that I have this 100% fixed before I set off and take my little guy for a ride, or take my wife for a ride. She's going to be frustrated if we get 20 miles out and this thing decides to, not start again. So I want to solve that issue. If it solved itself and the bike suddenly woke up, then, oh, that's great. I'll take it. But I want to be sure that that's the case. I thought that I'd be able to diagnose this pretty easy because for a while there, it actually wouldn't start, and it was doing that no start issue pretty consistently. It would just wouldn't run after it heated up. So I was like, great. Grab the tool, and it did exactly what happened last time I had that tool trying to test the system. Started up and it ran fine. So guys, that's how you would check the system, just like I did. This system seems to be working perfectly fine without any issues. I did briefly see a pulse generator not putting out a signal. So I am hoping that putting this back together and pretending to finish it tricks it into breaking again, and then I can catch it. But like I said, right now it's working perfectly fine. So I'm just going to move on to other tasks, and I'll keep starting this thing throughout, and we'll see if we can get it to duplicate that problem again. But guys, that is going to do it for this video here. Thank you so much for checking it out. If you liked the video, as always, give it a thumbs up. And be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell to get updates on this project and other ones I have coming to the channel. So we'll see you in the next one. Maybe I'll be riding it. I would love to be, but who knows?